And blasts have been reported across the Gulf as Iran launches retaliatory strikes. Waves of missiles and drones have targeted Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Jordan and Kuwait. Iran says it's targeting American bases in the region. And major airlines have cancelled flights across the Middle East. Israel, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar have closed their airspaces, and planes en route to cities like Tel Aviv have been diverted. All flights have been suspended at Dubai's international airport until further notice. Authorities have advised passengers not to travel to the airport and to check with their airlines for flight updates. It marks the latest upheaval for air travel in what is a usually very busy region. Journalist Emily Gordine joins me now from Dubai. Emily, hi there. We're hearing reports of waves of explosions in Dubai. What can you tell us about that?
Well, in Dubai, there have been drones have been spotted around the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world here in Dubai. But we've also heard about strikes. When you are out and about, you will occasionally hear interceptions in the air, loud explosions, essentially. We understand that a hotel on the Palm Jumeirah was also hit by a strike. Video footage shows fires that broke out at the scene. And so the atmosphere in Dubai is understandably very tense. People have been all day trying to go about their days as much as possible, also in the light of the fact that the city is not made, does not provide shelters. It is not built with a shelter infrastructure, so people almost have no choice. And it also has to be said that Dubai in the past has been considered one of, if not the safest city in the world. That's why also tourists have been flocking here, despite warnings that a conflict could erupt in the region. And now that image of a city that is exempt from conflict around it, that's now getting a real dent.
Now, we've got some brief footage from the Dubai hills that was shared with us. We can show some of that. You've said that there was warnings that something could erupt. So people did have an inkling, based on what you've said, that these attacks might happen?
Well, people expected Iranian retaliation maybe on US bases in the United Arab Emirates. What they did not expect were strikes on civilian targets, and the fact that drones have been spotted around the Burj Khalifa in central Dubai is a shock to people, and so is the footage coming from strikes on hotels, on local areas like the Dubai Hills that we can see in the footage just now. That is a real surprise and a real shock to people, because that is not what they had expected at all.
And did I hear you correctly in your first answer that people don't have air raid shelters to go to?
That's right. They don't have air raid shelters, and in a lot of cases here in Dubai, you also don't get warnings on your phones. In Abu Dhabi, there reportedly had been some notifications urging people to go inside to seek shelter there if you want. But in Dubai so far, there have not been any air alert, like air sirens. There's not been any notifications on the phones. So basically, the only time when people realise that there is a threat incoming is when they hear the explosions in the air, when some of these attacks, some of these strikes are intercepted by the Emirati air defences, which have been quite successful, we are told, at fending them off. But it has to be said that they've also gotten a fair bit of support by the Americans that have, built up massive military capabilities in the region over the past few weeks. So Emiratis and the people who live here, as well as the tourists who come here, all they can really do is, at this point, stay inside and hope that their building where they're staying is not hit in any ways.
Emily Gordine, a journalist in Dubai, thank you so much for that. And I'm joined by our Chief International Editor, Richard Walker, in the studio. Richard, good to have you here. Let's begin with Germany. What's the response by the government been to what's happened today?
Yeah, so the government has been holding kind of crisis talks. The Chancellor Friedrich Merz has been holding a lot of phone calls, as we hear, with a lot of international leaders and partners. And yeah, he put out a statement, which I think was quite interesting. It was quite a sort of carefully worded statement, because it's a statement that, on the one hand, is very critical of Iran, calling it out for, not having provided, really good answers in the negotiations that have been taking place, that they have not agreed to shut down their nuclear program, that they have not agreed to shut down their ballistic missile program, and so on. So very critical of Iran, and trying to sound vaguely supportive implicitly for the United States and Israel, on the other hand, but not going as far as actually saying we support this. Yeah. Between the lines, there are some kind of gentle hints of concern. For instance, Friedrich Merz calling for a resumption of negotiations, saying that would contribute to, lowering the risks for the region. So implicitly, that maybe this violence is increasing the risks of the region. But I think these cautiously worded statements sort of point to the sort of dilemma that the Europeans find themselves in that they're not really players in this. They don't want to come out and say that Donald Trump is taking very significant risks for an uncertain goal of regime change or whatever the goal may be. And also concerns about international law.
Exactly. How does this cautious position by the Europeans square with international law?
Yeah, so I think they wouldn't say this publicly, but I think most European governments would probably look at this and think, okay, well, this does not square with international law. It does not have UN Security Council backing. This is not an act of self-defense. There's not like an imminent threat coming out of Iran. And I think the Europeans, of course, they always want to hold up international law as something that's very important to the European Union. It's extremely important to Germany as a country that really wants to always hold up international law as something that's been committed to ever since the end of the Second World War. And it's also central to the Europeans' position on the Ukraine war, always saying that Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is illegal, correctly saying that. So it does open up the Europeans to accusations of double standards, which have become pretty frequent in the last few years. So I think this is one reason why they're so cautious around this topic. But we should note that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is a little bit bolder, talking that there were grave consequences from this, and saying that France would bring this up in the UN Security Council.
Let's talk a bit more about what's happened today itself on the back of a big military build-up in the region from the US, these indirect negotiations that have been happening over the last few weeks. Why has the US decided to act now? Is there a particular aspect of the timing that it sees as an opportunity?
Yeah, it is interesting because it really is very much a war of choice, isn't it? There's no ticking time bomb which is forcing Donald Trump's hand here. They're just forcing the Israelis' hand here. There's no sense that the nuclear program was about to make some huge step. In fact, it was hugely set back by the Americans last year. One trigger has evidently been the protest that happened earlier this year, and Donald Trump kind of came out and he said, help is on the way at that time. And it's taken a long time to build up that force. One factor is this sense there's an opportunity that Iran is still weakened after everything that happened last year, this sense that the negotiations haven't been getting anywhere. But also you have this sense of that this force is there, it's ready, and you cannot maintain that kind of degree of readiness for a very long time. So maybe a mixture of these things.
And the overall goal?
Yeah, so Donald Trump's statement that we saw is really fascinating. It's really worth watching or reading in full. Partly for this mix of goals that he sets out. So he talks about, taking out the ballistic missile capabilities, destroying the Navy, setting back the nuclear program even further, although it already was set back. But the fact that it ends in this quite clear call for regime change. He says, lay down your arms or face certain death to the Iranian military. And he says to the Iranian people, when we are finished with this, take over your government. This is your chance to seize control. And this is really a big step for Trump because this sounds a lot like some neoconservatism, this this attitude that drove the Iraq war back in 2003, a war that Trump made his reputation partly in being so critical of. And I think what's quite interesting is a little bit of a contrast. I mean, he's basically calling for regime change, but not quite in the way that it was done in Iraq, where the Americans went in, they took over, and then had to deal with the aftermath. But he wants to do it in, it seems, in a lighter way. So he wants to remove the regime, but not necessarily install something that comes afterwards. And it calls to mind, you remember Colin Powell, the US Secretary of State at the time, who said to George W. Bush, legendarily, you know, his attitude was, you break it, you own it. Yeah. You go into Iraq, you break the regime, then you own the consequences, you own the aftermath. Donald Trump seemingly doesn't want that. He wants to, his attitude seems to be, we break it, you own it, you, the Iranian people. But the question is, well, can they? What will that lead to? And isn't it just an invitation to a civil war?
How does this square off, based on what you've just said? Donald Trump sort of campaigned on having no more, not involving the US in any more conflicts, and here we are. America
first, exactly. And there's a lot of disquiet on the, you know, the sort of full-on America first crowd behind Trump, that they really feel that this is a betrayal. And it's interesting, we've seen a kind of a creeping movement here in Trump's second term, that he's become much more bold, much more aggressive on the world stage, even towards NATO member states. What we saw in Venezuela just a few months ago, that was a decapitation, you know, take out the president, keep the regime. But this definitely goes further. I think one thing we'll have to be watching is I think Donald Trump seems to be focused on building a legacy, and maybe he saw an opportunity to make history here that could burnish his legacy in a way that he never thought possible.
Thanks a lot, Richard Walker, our Chief International Editor.
And now let's bring in Bente Scheller. She is the head of the Middle East and North Africa division at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is affiliated to Germany's Green Party. Bente, we are seeing strikes throughout the Middle East today. How close are we to a broader conflict in the region?
I think at least we can say that this might be the first step into a larger escalation. I'm hearing from Israel that the planning is for the coming 4 days. But I think often in the region we've seen that victory could not be established as quickly as it was intended. And therefore, I'm not sure whether we will really see a limited intervention only, or whether it might take longer time, and what we will see as reactions.
Now, there has been a flurry of diplomatic chatter, reportedly. Are there any voices now that could help to de-escalate this conflict?
I'm not sure about that, because this happens in a situation in which negotiations between the US and Iran were underway. And if we remember yesterday evening, which seems like a lifetime ago, there the Omanian mediator said, well, Iran is ready, the regime is ready to cease all nuclear activities and dilute the uranium they had already enriched, which sounded quite promising. So I'm not sure whether good offices and mediation will now be able to have a role here, or whether now first the US and Israel want to create a different military situation on the ground.
Now, what kind of message do you think does the action of the US and Israel send to other countries in the region?
Well, I think the main message is that you can't really rely on negotiations. We always have to calculate that Trump's patience is wearing thin easily. And here also, I think what you can mostly learn is that there are no guarantees, that if you are negotiating, the result can be expected. Sometimes there is military action before. And I think we have seen a show of power, not only in this situation, but also before of Trump.
Now, if the Iranian government were to fall, what kind of ramifications would that have for the region?
It would very much depend on the outcome, because what we have not seen, even though there were huge protests all across the country, which were really met with harsh violence of the Iranian regime, we have not seen defections, and the apparatus is very much intact. Therefore, I think one of the scenarios that is very likely is that it would be rather an infighting, that somebody else from the current regime would take over, very much as we have seen in Venezuela, where we saw only the head of the government government was taken out, the rest remains intact. That, of course, would not introduce a new policy. If the opposition were to win, of course, that would be a new opening and would open many doors, both internally as well as to the region. But I think we might be quite far from that.
Now, if the US and Israel fail in their goal to achieve regime change and shut down the nuclear program for good, do you think we could see an escalating pattern of military strikes moving forward?
We could see that, or a simmering conflict that will continue to destabilize the region. I think it is really difficult to see how the goals should be achieved. First of all, they seem clear from the outside, but then if you dig deeper, they are not. Is it regime change, or is it the nuclear program? Is it the ballistic program? What is the core item to be achieved? And I think these are maximalist goals. How do you want to determine that the entire military threat that emanates from Iran for Israel or the region is gone? So I think it will be really difficult to establish what an achievement is, and therefore, when are you going to end this war, and when are you going to enter negotiations that could lead to a stable framework?
Bente Scheller there from the Heinrich Böll Foundation here in Berlin. Thank you very much.
Thank you.